The Metroidvania genre is a pretty interesting genre of video games. From my experience, Metroidvanias aim to combine platforming with combat. These games involve slowly gathering upgrades over time, and they take a lot of inspiration from the Metroid franchise as well as the Castlevania franchise. The truth is, around 10 months ago, I didn't really even know the Metroidvania genre was a thing. That is, until I played two games, Hollow Knight and Ori and the Will of the Wisps. These two games are probably the two most popular Metroidvanias. Hollow Knight wasn't an instant success, but the game is now highly regarded as the ultimate Metroidvania, and for good reason. This game might be a top 30 video game of all time. Hollow Knight is pretty much a study guide for people who want to learn how to design a great game. I could keep going on and on about how great this game is, but we'll save that for later in the video. But Hollow Knight wasn't the first Metroidvania I played. The first one I played was Ori and the Will of the Wisps. This game is a sequel to a Metroidvania released in 2015 by the name of Ori and the Blind Forest, which is also a super popular Metroidvania. I picked up both the Blind Forest and the Will of the Wisps around August of last year because I recognized the gameplay from a Scout the Woz video, funny enough. I didn't play much of the Blind Forest due to some performance issues I was having, but I gave the Will of the Wisps a try and I fell in love. This game became one of my favorite video games of all time in a matter of days. I did eventually go back to the Blind Forest and I loved that game as well, but this video is about the second game. Anyway, I think Ori and the Will of the Wisps is a phenomenal video game, but can it stand a chance against Hollow Knight, a game that the overwhelming majority of people consider to be the best Metroidvania? Honestly, I think this game does stand a chance, and if I didn't think so, I wouldn't be making this video. So in this video, I'm going to be comparing two Metroidvanias, Hollow Knight and Ori and the Will of the Wisps. I'll try to be as non-biased as possible when comparing these two games. I'll be comparing things like their graphics, combat, bosses, and much more. I actually made a YouTube short a few months ago about comparing these two games, but some opinions have changed, and I also wanted to make a full video on this topic. Before we start, this might be obvious, but I do want to mention that this video is entirely subjective and should not be interpreted as objective fact. At the end of the day, these are just my opinions on these two games. The only reason I'm making this video is because I love both games, so I'll try to treat both of them as fairly as possible. And the last thing I want to mention before we begin is that we are so close to monetizing this channel. It means the world to me that this channel has been met with so much support over the past year. I can't wait to invest more resources into this channel, so even just watching the videos supports me, and I thank you for that. But with all that being said, let us begin. For the first comparison, we're going to be comparing platforming. Which game is the better platformer? Well, this one should be pretty obvious. It's Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Ori is way more focused on platforming compared to Hollow Knight. The level design in this game is also just fantastic. Most of the abilities you unlock in this game massively play into the level design, giving every level its own unique gimmick. This game is actually kind of like if Zelda was a platformer because the levels are set up almost the same as dungeons from the Zelda franchise. Around halfway into the level, you are introduced to a new ability, similar to how dungeons work. You then use this ability to traverse the rest of the level. Anyway, I don't really want to go down a huge rabbit hole about the level design because all you need to know is this game excels at platforming. However, that's not to say that Hollow Knight's platforming is bad. Hollow Knight has decent platforming throughout the entire game, but it's just not the main focus. There is the White Palace and the Path of Pain area. These two areas have really fun platforming. It still doesn't compare to the entirety of Ori and the Will of the Wisps though. So Hollow Knight has good platforming overall, but it just can't compete with the competition in this comparison. 1 point to Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Now we move on to our second comparison, combat. Which game has the best combat? Similar to platforming, this comparison isn't really close. Hollow Knight wins by a long shot. Let's just say combat is not one of Ori's strengths. It's not terrible or anything, but it's sort of clunky and just a more messy version of Hollow Knight's combat. There's all these different weapons to get in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, which isn't a bad thing, but it almost feels like too much. They aren't balanced very well, and a lot of the weapons are only useful 5% of the time. The combat just isn't great in this game, but you can't say the same for Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight's combat is almost perfect. It's a very simple system. You swing this nail, you hit an enemy until it dies. But that's a very oversimplified way to explain it. There's two types of weapons to use in this game, the nail and the spells. The nail is the traditional weapon and can be used whenever, but has limited range. Spells have better reach and usually do more damage, but require an ammunition known as soul to operate. This is just a really simple but really good system. The combat overall is is also balanced way better than it is in Ori. So to sum the first two comparisons up, Ori focuses most on platforming, whereas Hollow Knight focuses most on combat. While they both focus on platforming and combat, they're both best at one while less great at the other. So two comparisons in, and we've already seen both games dominate the other in a certain category. Anyway, the score is now tied 1-1, so let's move on to the third comparison. For the third comparison, let's talk about visuals. Visuals will include graphics, art style, and performance. Let's start off with the general graphics. Both games look great, even on the Nintendo Switch. In terms of art style, you can obviously tell that Hollow Knight goes for a cartoon look, but it's not really clear how to define Ori's art style. I would say Ori's art style is trying to catch the essence of beautiful nature, but that's still kind of vague. I'm not going to talk too long about visuals because honestly, I think this category is a tie. I think that Ori is the more beautiful game, but Hollow Knight still looks great and has a more original art style. Also, in terms of performance, the Switch version of Ori and the Will of the Wisps has some frame rate issues, whereas Hollow Knight on the Switch remains rock solid. But overall, they both have great visuals. One is more beautiful, one is more unique, so this category is a tie. Both games will be given an additional point. For the fourth comparison, we're finally going to be comparing the boss fights, and I'm pretty sure we all know which game wins this category. I mean, this one isn't even close. This is by far the most lopsided comparison in the video. Hollow Knight probably has one of the greatest boss lineups in the history of the video game industry. Hollow Knight basically has 46 bosses, and most of them are either pretty good or straight up amazing. Ori has 6 boss fights and they all suck. Jokes aside, Ori doesn't have very many bosses compared to Hollow Knight, but the bosses we do get are pretty decent. There's nothing amazing about them, but there's nothing terrible about them. And technically there's 9 boss fights if you count the 3 escape levels. The escape levels basically involve being chased by something, whether it's a boss or a force of nature. The escape levels are one of Ori's defining features. They're incredibly fun, they're well designed, they look stunning, and they have incredible soundtrack to boost the experience even further. A few of the bosses even have escape levels at the beginning or in between boss phases, which is pretty cool. But even though I love the escape levels in Ori, they realistically don't count as boss fights. They're basically just fast-paced levels. And even if they counted as boss fights, it still wouldn't beat Hollow Knight's incredible boss lineup. Hollow Knight has some truly unforgettable bosses. Broken Vessel, Hornet, the Hollow Knight, Nightmare King Grim, Mantis Lords. So yeah, this is by far the easiest comparison of the video. Ori's bosses aren't objectively bad, but they don't even stand a chance. So Hollow Knight wins this category easily, giving the game a 3-2 lead. Moving on to the fifth comparison, let's talk about story. This is going to be a very difficult one to determine because these two games have two very different story setups. There might be minor spoilers in this segment, so if that's something you're worried about, I'd suggest skipping ahead to the next comparison. So let's start with Ori and the Will of the Wisps story. This game has a very surface level story. It's a nice story with a whole lot of emotion included, but like I said, everything is very straightforward. It's basically just a super simple story. Everything you need to know is pretty much shouted directly into your face. None of the characters ever hide anything from you. You get told to do a task, you complete said task, and then you're given more things to go do. I know this is super vague, but I'm trying to spoil as little as possible. All you need to know is that it's a super simple story, but it's got some great moments. I don't think simple stories are inherently bad. Sure, this game can't compete with Red Dead Redemption 2 or anything, but it does a good job at providing a story that really makes the player care about the surrounding characters. As for Hollow Knight's story is almost the complete opposite. Hollow Knight's story is super loose and untamed, however, it does have its emotional moments. In Hollow Knight, you play as this little bug guy that most fans just refer to as the Knight. To understand the Knight's motivation for everything you do in the game, you have to do a lot of digging around, metaphorically speaking. This is what we call Hollow Knight's lore. This game is not focused on bringing you an easily digestible story. Instead, the game focuses on creating this insanely deep narrative, and the key to understanding this is, well, I don't really know the best way to understand it. The only reason I know anything about the lore of this game is because of the infamous Hollow Knight lore video by a YouTube channel called Mossbag. I'm sure most of you have already watched this video considering it's insanely iconic at this point. Understanding the story of this game is insanely confusing, but when you finally get a grasp of it, it all just clicks. On the surface, this game's story is completely incoherent and it doesn't make any sense, but under the surface is where you find Hollow Knight's masterful story. story. This game has an insanely deep narrative to the point where it makes Ori's story look like baby food. However, Ori's story is great at what it does. It's a simple story designed to be emotional, and emotional it is. I really don't think I can make a case for one story to be better than the other, so I'll once again have to give them a tie. Hollow Knight is leading 4-3. Moving on to the 6th comparison, and for this one we're going to be talking about a broader concept, originality. Which game is more original? I think this one probably has to go to Hollow Knight. Before I start talking about that though, I want to address a concern that people have pointed out about Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Did Ori and the Will of the Wisps copy Hollow Knight? Mossbag also made a video on this topic a while back, but I never got around to watching it, so take my opinion with a grain of salt. But let's go over some things that Ori seemingly copied from Hollow Knight. I think the most obvious ones are the boss fights and the shards. Bosses weren't in the first Ori game. It's not like Hollow Knight trademarked the video game boss fight or anything, but it is a little suspicious to add bosses to the game after Hollow Knight's success. Ori and the Will of the Wisps also has these things called shards, and they pretty much do the exact same thing as charms from Hollow Knight. And one more thing I want to mention, Ori and the Blind Forest didn't really have any melee combat. Ori did not have a sword in that game, but in the Will of the Wisps, he does. I do agree that it seems like this game tried to take from Hollow Knight, but here's something to consider. There isn't really a such thing as an original Metroidvania. The whole genre is about taking elements from past games and using them to create a new game. Hollow Knight is the most original Metroidvania in my opinion, but it does have features that were inspired by games like Super Metroid. A lot of people have also told me that this game takes a lot of inspiration from the Dark Souls franchise, but I can't confirm that since I've never played a Dark Souls game. But all things considered, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is not a ripoff of Hollow Knight, but I do think Hollow Knight is a lot more original than Ori, and I do think that Hollow Knight inspired certain features in the Will of the Wisps, so I do think Hollow Knight wins this category, which gives it a 5-3 lead. For the 7th comparison, we're going to be talking about the soundtrack. Which game has the better soundtrack? This will be the last major comparison of the video, but afterwards we'll discuss some minor comparisons. I wanted to save this one for last because, believe it or not, soundtrack is my favorite part of video games, and these two games are a big reason why. Let's start with Hollow Knight's soundtrack. This game's soundtrack fits right in with the rest of the game. In other words, it's an amazing soundtrack with an insane amount of memorable tracks. Every single track in this game is great, but there is some standouts like the Broken Vessel theme, the City of Tears, Truth, Beauty, and Hatred, and of course the Sealed Vessel theme, which you're hearing right now. Many have also pointed out the fact that every track in this game perfectly portrays the setting it's placed in, and this helps the game feel that much more immersive than it already is. Of course, there's other games that I think have better soundtracks, but Hollow Knight has an incredible soundtrack, and that cannot be overstated. Hollow Knight has an amazing soundtrack, but guess what? So does Ori. Ori and the Will of the Wisps has my favorite soundtrack in video game history. That might sound like hyperbole, but I'm not joking. The orchestration in this game is amazing. I generally get goosebumps when I hear the theme you're hearing in the background. Music like this is why I will always love video games. And of course, this track isn't the only phenomenal track in the game. The whole soundtrack is otherworldly. There is not a single track in this game that I don't at least like. I said earlier that Ori does emotion very well. The game's soundtrack helps push that emotion to an insane level, creating a game that can easily send anyone in tears. There really aren't a whole lot of other games with soundtracks like these two games. All things considered, I'm once again going to give these two games a tie on this one. I can't make any legitimate distinctions between these two soundtracks. They're both equally incredible. So that brings the score to 6-4 in favor of Hollow Knight. So now that we've gotten the major comparisons out of the way, I want to go over some smaller things. These comparisons will each count as half a point on the scoreboard. Let's get started. Which game is the most memorable? I think that really depends on what your tastes are. Both of these games have incredibly memorable moments. This category is a tie, which means both games will be given half a point. Which game is the most iconic? Hollow Knight is way more iconic than Ori. Whether it's the clone that you find in Deep Nest or Hornet telling the player to get good, this game is a lot more iconic than the competition. There's a difference between being memorable and iconic, and I think Hollow Knight has both while Ori only has the memorability. Hollow Knight wins this category easily. Which game has the better map? Both games have good maps, but Hollow Knight's map is bigger and has more secrets to find, so that's gotta be the answer. And finally, which game has more content? I got every achievement in Ori and the Will of the Wisps in less than 45 hours. In Hollow Knight, it took me a little over 115 hours to get every achievement, so I think that's your answer. Hollow Knight has a lot more content than Ori, and in my opinion, Hollow Knight finds the perfect amount of content. So there you have it. The final score for today's video is 8 to 4.5. Now look, I understand from this angle the scoreboard looks super lopsided, but in reality I think these games are very close to one another, and reviewers seem to agree with me. While I chose Hollow Knight to be the better game in this comparison, the reality is that both of these games are worth playing. There's still a few things I could have talked about, like the difficulty or the price points, but I think this is a good spot to end the video. Like I said in the intro, this video is entirely my opinion, and I love both of these games. In fact, even though Ori lost this comparison, I think the Ori games might be more of my type of game than Hollow Knight is. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. But either way, thanks for checking out this video. You guys are a big reason why this channel is growing so rapidly. I'm so close to turning this channel into a career, and I have you to thank for that. So with all that being said, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.